September 11th, 2001. It was a day of horror, chaos, and ultimate terror that still lives on in the memories of many. September 11th, 2006. 5 years after the infamous terrorist attacks on our nation, most of America is back to normal. New York City remains a vivacious city that truly never sleeps. Naturally, though, the country has become more cautious and careful, taking extra measures to ensure national security. On 9/11, New York City lost its famous emblems, the Twin Towers. As the 5-year anniversary of the attacks appears over the horizon, one can see that the heart of New York is still broken. NABE and AUBER meet annually. In 2001, the World Trade Center was the choice spot for their upcoming conference.
Being there because in 1998 I chose the World Trade Center on my ascent to the presidency of NABE as our location for that particular meeting.
Diane Swank and Carl Tannenbaum were at our table, and there were several students who were new members of NABE.
I was a student member of NABE at the time, and we were meeting with the past presidents.
First thing I noticed, the lights blinked. I looked up, and I could see the chandeliers waving back and forth.
NABE members were feeling the effects of the first plane crashing into the North Tower. However, they assumed it was something else.
When the plane hit, we were in an enclosed space, so all we did was feel what happened, didn't know what had happened.
All of a sudden the lights went off and it came back, and right in that moment I thought it was just, a blackout, something temporary.
I was standing there, all of a sudden I just felt the building shake. And I'm like, instead of earthquake, it's like, there was like stuff falling, but the first thing I thought of was it had to have been an earthquake.
I thought at the time might have been a subway crash or something like that, this vibration.
One NABE member, Chris Varvaris, had not yet made it to the breakfast. He too felt the effects of the first plane from his hotel bedroom at the World Trade Center Marriott.
Sat on the bed and turned on CNBC or Bloomberg to see what was going on in the pre-market activity, and I heard this, boom. It was like almost like I thought of thunder actually, because there had been a thunderstorm the night before. Although, almost immediately I remembered I'd already looked outside the window and it was a clear blue day.
As debris began to fall outside the building and alarms rang within, it became clear that this was much more.
Commentators were speculating that it was a small private plane that had run into the tower.
And then the building began to tremble, and people said it's a bomb, it's a car bomb, because many people remember the previous experience in '93.
A fire alarm went off, and then someone said, "Get out of the building."
Outside, people were rushing in various directions to flee from the World Trade Center. However, NABE members faced complications in escaping.
The problem was because people were already falling and glass had imploded in the front atrium of the hotel, which was connected to the World Trade Center, that we couldn't leave quickly.
I had gone behind the World Financial Center, and there met a bunch of NABE people back there. When they told us to move, the police came along, told everybody to move and go either north or south. There were people laying in the street. There were cars that were sort of in a jumble, so to speak, in front of the hotel.
Seeing all of the emergency medical entry teams and the firemen going into the area right next to the towers.
Groups of NABE members soon pushed their way through the crowds and were able to begin their routes from the World Trade Center.
When we got out of the building, we discovered that a plane had hit the first tower, but at that point we thought it was an accident. As we walked away from the building, we walked group of us walked south towards Battery Park.
I kept telling the foreign students that we had and some of the foreigners that we had with us to run towards the lady, which was the Statue of Liberty, because I thought it would be safer to be in a place where there weren't tall buildings.
To some, the worst seemed over, but it was hardly from it.
I saw this airplane coming from, I spotted around above the Statue of Liberty and coming in and coming down and down, and my thought was that it was probably doing some form of reconnaissance over lower Manhattan to see what was coming in. And when it got closer, I thought, well, maybe it's not a great idea to have a jetliner to do reconnaissance over a populated area.
And I noticed some people across the street who were looking up to my right and pointing up.
And then it kept coming down and down, and at one point you had to realize, it's really a matter of seconds, but you had to realize in those moments that it's not going to move out.
I happened to look up just as the other plane came in and crashed into the World Trade Center. I saw the plane, I saw it crash through in a ball of flame, and it was at that moment I realized that what had happened before wasn't an accident, but obviously an act of war or terror. And of course the whole mood and mentality changed.
The second plane made it clear that this was no mistake. These were acts of terrorism. Soon news would reach the members of other attacks on the country.
A couple of people had radios and had heard that there was another plane, several planes in the air. We heard about the Pentagon and heard there was at least one additional one. But obviously it became a lot more frightening at that point than it had been initially.
Those with loved ones in New York became concerned and wanted to find out if they were all right. Bruce Cradaville was uneasy about his wife and daughter that had accompanied him to New York.
They had lingered in the hotel room, were still there, but ran down 18 flights of stairs, happened to go out the same door I did, saw people with name badges, followed the trail, and we found each other within about 5 minutes.
Bruce and his family soon boarded the first ferry they could, headed for Staten Island.
Most unusual thing was that probably for the first time ever, as people got on the Staten Island ferry, they reached underneath, took out the moldy old life jackets and strapped themselves in.
Also, Stuart Hoffman was not with his wife Jody that morning and worried if she had been able to escape.
She ended up in Battery Park where she found her, as we call him, her guardian angel, Dave Weiss. He was one of our NABE members, and she happened to recognize him. And Dave lives in Manhattan, and she clung to Dave like Velcro. And they walked, I guess, the 4 hours up the east side in throngs of people to his apartment, where by about 1:15 she arrived and called our niece's apartment, where I was at by then, and told me she was okay and where she was.
As people headed away from the buildings, emergency vehicles headed towards them. Firemen and police alike were going in as rescue teams for those still trapped inside.
So probably 24 or more firemen were coming through, and you could see, they were absolutely silent. They weren't saying anything, and you could see that there was fear.
Impending danger awaited the unfortunate rescuers.
Stepping out from behind the building on the World Financial Center campus onto Vesey Street when I heard what I thought was another jet engine. I mean, it's just the sound it made, as if you're standing on the tarmac and you hear that engine revving up.
My instant reaction was, oh no, a third plane had hit, a typical terrorist type activity. Wait for a crowd to gather and attack them again.
What I realized that was the South Tower collapsing, and it was making that sound. It was pushing that much air.
The fire from the jet fuel had melted the structural steel beams, and the South Tower collapsed under its own weight, destroying the Marriott Hotel as it fell. Minutes later, the North Tower suffered the same fate.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
After these events, dust, debris, and wreckage lay over the decimated area. After only a few hours, what had once been the World Trade Centers was now an empty void.
And shortly thereafter, the second tower collapsing, knowing at that point instantly that they had collapsed all of those people who were down there.
I think for me, everything was like in slow motion. Was that for you? It was
and it was very
like
quiet.
Yeah.
There was no noise.
It was very quiet because when I got outside, it was very quiet. Almost like, you watch those movies and it's the end of the world. All you see is like these smoke in the air and there was nobody around.
However, other parts of New York were still bustling, having not yet recognized or known what had happened.
Walking into Midtown around Times Square, a group of us were pretty much covered in our clothes, were covered in dust. Some of us still had dust in our hair. And yet, when we walked into Times Square, people were milling about as if it were a normal day. They were heading off to have lunch because it was about noontime that we arrived, and the feeling was of being from a different world, walking almost like we were invisible because people didn't.
That evening of the attacks, NABE members graciously accepted hotel rooms or hospitality from friends and family.
Unfortunately, through my bank PNC, I was actually able to get a room at the Waldorf because we had no place to stay. And my niece's apartment, being a typical New York apartment, had enough room for one person, let alone about 6 of us.
I finally went back to one of the hotels at 79th and Amsterdam and sat down in their lobby. About an hour later, because my feet were killing me, an hour later, a manager came over and asked whether I'd been with them the previous night. And I said, no, I've been down at the World Trade Center Marriott, and my bags were still there in the rubble. Oh, at that point, they had a room for me, in spite of having been told twice that they didn't.
I have a goddaughter who lives in New Jersey, and the plan always was to try and find some way across the river to take the train out to hole up with her and her family, who we've known for years. You remember that Manhattan is an island, though. You don't really realize that until you're trying to get off of the island. We finally made our way out there, and the wife of the family, who we've known for many years and spent many New Years with, I had never seen her take a drink. And when we walked in the door of their home, covered with the dust and detritus from the tragedy, she went straight for the liquor cabinet.
That all of my friends and colleagues who were with us at the conference were able to safely get home eventually. Some of them by very circuitous routes, but they all did safely get home.
Indeed, all members were extremely fortunate for this. And after 5 years, they still believe that.
You wake up every morning, you take a breath, and you're thankful for it.
We count ourselves lucky and blessed to be able to talk about it.
However, images on the news of the attacks were a constant reminder that the world had changed.
It was tough. I was living in Washington, D.C. There was a psychosis about a terrorist. We had the sniper in Northern Virginia that was adding the anthrax scare. So it was a tough 6 months to 1 year to live in Washington, D.C.
But not just the world is different. Many members' lives have become altered as well due to the attacks.
I made my peace with God. I wear my crucifix everywhere I travel. Sometimes slows me getting through security.
I think I've gotten much closer to my family. And of course, I think I'm a lot more jumpy about things.
I must admit there were a couple of times when I had momentary concerns about hearing planes flying low.
It was difficult at first. I always kept myself, I didn't have a cell phone then. I bought one, a flashlight and a radio, and kept them by me for at least 2 years after the incident. I don't carry all those things right now, but loud noises, planes flying overhead, something that made you stop and think what's going on.
Since the attacks on September 11th, several members have found their paths crossing with New York City again.
I went with friends a couple of times, just doing bus tours. It was actually about 2-3 years later that it felt more odd than it did the first few times because the experience seemed so totally unreal at that point.
I rewalk exactly the same path that we walked with the group at the time. After filtering and seeing those images on TV so many times, I lost a little bit the memory and the perspective of the actual distances. So when I went back to Ground Zero and I walked to Battery Park, all of a sudden I realized how close we were. Somewhat my memory had filtered and I could, just expecting the distances to be a little bit more. It was really a matter of 4 blocks, 5 blocks. It was right there.
It happened to be around the period where they had found quite a number of firemen recovered their bodies in the southeast corner of the pit. And while we were up there, we could see them taking out a couple of stretchers that were draped in flags.
Ground Zero is also a key area that NABE members have returned to since the attacks.
Most incredible thing was just the emptiness, just the void. There was nothing there. It used to be so vibrant, so energetic, so full of life, and it was just dead.
And I found that going back to the site, which at that point, 5 weeks on, was still barren, was very hard, but in many ways cleansing. And that night I had my first good night's sleep.
And as for the rebuilding of the trade centers, or even a memorial, NABE members have mixed views.
I think there should be a memorial there, but by the same token, there should be commercial buildings should be rebuilt there.
The taller the better.
I think there will be some space for a memorial for the victim of the days, those who lost their life, and those, as many of us, who have their life changed in the experience.
This nation stands with the good people of New York City.
That I don't think about it.
I cherish moments more. I cherish friendships more. I think in a strange way it's added a quality that I didn't have before.
I think it's important to keep the memories of that day alive because, again, sometimes going back to the routine helps, going back to your work really helps. It helps to move on, it helps to go back to normalcy in your life. At the very same time, there was something exceptional we lived through and we learned on those days, and I think it's very important never to forget what we have learned then.